My black skin gleaming, my black hair kinking, my plum red lipstick. It'll make sense to you later. Okay. My name is Jafari Sinclair Allen, Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies, ADS, and the Director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, IRAS. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues at AAADS and IRAS and the Africana Studies Department at Barnard, and to briefly introduce the remarkable event that we are all fortunate to share this evening. Today's engagement with the inimitable Corinne Bailey Rae is supported by the AAADS IRAS Mellon Arts Project. Launched during the 2020-2021 academic year, thanks to the Mellon Foundation, Mellon Arts is a 3-year collaboration between Columbia Department's Harlem-based national and international cultural institutions. It includes an artist residency, Black Arts Dialogue Series, and the Black Curators Matter Oral History Project. The partnerships created through this initiative are designed to sustain the centrality of the arts in AAADS and its broader intellectual community, signaling a new way of conceptualizing the relationship of the arts to both research and teaching by valuing artists and their work not only as subjects of analysis, but also as central to helping shape our understanding of history, society, and culture. A sterling example of this focus on artists as primary knowledge producers and knowledge reshapers, those who, like me, were fortunate to witness her triumphant Black Rainbows Tour residency at the Blue Note were treated to an example of this. Not only an evening of wonderful music, but also new facets of what our colleague Saidiya Hartman has called a critical fabulation. Grounded in actual archives of Black life and culture collected by Theaster Gates at the Stoney Island Arts Bank in Chicago, photos, transcripts, records, books, magazines, objects, artworks, and her lived experience there, Black Rainbow tells historic and embellished stories, speculates on the past and present, and opens beautiful, crucial portals to possible futures. Wide-ranging in its themes, Black Rainbow's subjects are drawn from encounters with objects in the Arts Bank, taking us, for example, from a riot girl punk homage to Miss New York Transit 1957, who the record reveals as the legendary Audrey Smaltz, to a pain to the sliver of sunset from Harriet Jacobs' Garret, or Loophole of Retreat. Black Rainbows explores Black femininity, spell work, inner space, outer space, time collapse, and ancestors, and the foolhardy attempt to erase Black childhood. Corinne Bailey Rae describes herself as a, quote, soul-rooted contemporary R&B singer, songwriter, and musician. With multiple top 10 UK and US albums, she released her self-titled debut solo album in 2006, topping the UK album chart and reaching number 4 in the US and featuring the number 2 single, Put Your Records On. I won't sing it. Even though I hear it. She also earned 3 Grammy nominations and 2 Mobos. A year later, she was featured on Herbie Hancock's Grammy Award winner River, The Joni Letters, and in 2010 released the critically acclaimed The Sea. Bailey Rae's version of Bob Marley's Is This Love, recorded on this top 10 album, won a Grammy for Best R&B Performance that year. Ms. Bailey Rae is joined in conversation by Dr. Kerry Jones. Dr. Jones is the Hans Hofmann Professor of Modern Art in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia and is the chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. Widely recognized as an expert on African American and African diaspora artists, Latinx and Latin American artists, and contemporary art and museum theory, not only have Dr. Jones's writings appeared in a multitude of exhibition catalogs and journals, she's also the author of 2 books published by Duke University Press, I-Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, and South of Pico, African American Artists in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s, which received the Walter and Lillian Lowenfels Criticism Award from the American Book Award. Her newest book, October Files, David Hammond's, is forthcoming from MIT Press. A member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Jones was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow in 2016 and has also won numerous other awards for her work, including the Lenfest Distinguished Faculty Award from Columbia University in 2023. This program was supported by the Mellon Foundation and conceived in collaboration with Africana Studies at Barnard College, the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, and the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Thanks all of our partners in this endeavor, including Rock Nation. So if you would, please join me in welcoming to the stage Corinne Bailey Rae and Kelly Jones.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here today, and I want to have a special shout out to Celia Naylor and Tamara Walker, who have been such great partners, as well as Michelle and all of Barnard Africana. It's wonderful to collaborate with you all, as always. So let's get started. We have the great Corinne Bailey Rae here, and this wonderful project, Black Rainbows. You were also at it's inspired by the Stoney Island Arts Bank that was started by Theaster Gates. So can you talk a little bit about your encounter with that and this kind of archival presence and what it really meant to you?
About 7 years ago, I didn't know of Theaster Gates. I didn't know his work, and I didn't know who he was. And I was looking at a friend's Pinterest page. I don't know if any of you use Pinterest or maybe used to use Pinterest, but there was one time Pinterest was this radical space. So it wasn't just like, look at these cute hairstyles, or like, this is what I did for my bedroom. But I had a friend called Jamala Johns that I met. She's from New York, and I met her through this online presence, and she was using her Pinterest board like it was a magazine, so that each board would pull you in, and she would write, and she had this board called Artists and Their Workspaces, and when you clicked on there, you would see Cara Walker arranging her silhouettes on glass, or you'd see Picasso painting with light. And I saw this photograph of this man, this black man, staring out of the frame, and it said he was an artist from White Cube, and I saw in the background some weird art that I didn't understand. There was a pile of bricks on the floor, there was a shaggy goat, and instead of legs it had spindles, and it's going around on a circular train track, and in the background there was a neon sign from a chicken shop, Harold's Chicken Shop, of a chef chasing a chicken with a meat cleaver. And I thought, what is all this stuff? What is this? This is art, and I don't understand it, and this is contemporary art, which I am not that familiar with. But here is this man, this black man, staring out to say, yeah, this is my work, And I thought, who is he? And I found out that he was Theaster Gates. I got to see his work. I connected with the work, with the paintings, with the physicality of the objects, the textures. And I saw that he had this building on the south side of Chicago that he ran with the Rebuild Foundation, which was this old bank called Stoney Island Arts Bank. It had been an old savings and loans bank. It's 100 years old this year, so it was built in 1924. And it had been on the south side of Chicago, which was once a really prosperous white area, and then it became a really prosperous, thriving middle-class area, and then it became an underserved community, is how people describe the South Side right now. And Theaster decided he wanted to save this building from demolition. He had seen too many buildings on the South Side just pulled down. And as we know, when you lose buildings from an area, maybe for a few years people walk past and say, didn't there used to be, you know, a theatre here? Or didn't there used to be a bank here? Didn't there used to be this huge shopping centre? And after a while, it kind of disappears from memory and something else gets made, and then you walk past and say, maybe it was a different street. So it was that kind of erasure of history. He wanted to stop it. So now the bank is filled, there you see it. Now the bank is filled with art archive, historic archive, and is a place for community. So Theaster bought the building, which was, you know, the basement was underwater. He bought it for $1 from the city, and he raised $6 million through selling his own art, and then continued to raise money to transform it. And now it's a place with the Johnson Publishing Company's library inside, 26,000 books that were collected by the Johnson family, who made Ebony Magazine and Jet Magazine and Negro Digest. And it has all of Frankie Knuckles' records in as well. So Frankie Knuckles' archive was given to the Arts Bank. And on the second floor, it has these difficult and problematic objects from America's past. So it has postcards, photographs, newspaper articles, objects for the home. They've been dubbed negrobilia, they're derogatory, anti-black objects, which this black and Chinese banker called Ed Williams would buy when he saw them in flea markets and yard sales to take them out of circulation. So he amassed 4,000 of these objects. He didn't want to share the space with them anymore, so they're in the bank as well. And so I was lucky that I invited Theaster Gates to come to our show. Dawood Bey is in the audience, which I'm very grateful of your attendance. And it was actually Dawood who connected my team with Theaster's team. And he came to our show, and I raced out for the dressing room at the end and was so excited to meet him. And I really wanted to go to the Arts Bank. And I said, I really want to come to the Arts Bank, but we're leaving town at 8 a.m. tomorrow. And he said, oh, that's okay. I'm also leaving town at 8 a.m. because I'm going to President Obama's 50th birthday party. And I thought, oh, this is who this artist is. You know, he's known. He's very well known. And so he invited us to the bank really early in the morning. And I opened the doors. You know, we knocked on the door. They were open to us. And it appeared to me in that moment to be a sort of cathedral to black art. You know, it had this incredible height. There were works on the walls, paintings, drawings. There was a sound suit by Nick Cave that was hanging up on the wall. I could look through the library. I could look in the drawers at these objects, you know, songs from slavery times, photographs, print advertisements from the 30s and 40s and 50s, physical objects, you know, sculptures, all of these things which I just, I felt them to be fizzing with a kind of present history. You know, I didn't find them to be old stuff, but when I held them, I felt like they had a story to tell. And when I left, I was on tour, and I was in my tour bus, and I was meant to be concentrating on the work that I was doing, but all I could think about was this place and the photos I'd seen and the newspapers I'd read and the stories that I had observed, and I knew I wanted to go back. And so I went back over many years. You know, I went back for a 2-week residency and stayed locally, and we went every day, and then any time I could get to Chicago, I would go and stay and read and look around and hold and record there. You know, we did our recording there at the beginning of that residency.
It's amazing to hear you talk about how objects resonate with you, because as an art historian and a curator, I always feel that the objects talk to me and that they have their own history. And as I've written before, you know, sometimes these are the only parts of history. They're the only memories of history in these objects. But you've also said, you know, in looking at that memorabilia, negrobilia, as he calls it, Mr. Williams, Mr. and Mrs. Williams negrobilia, it's like his family said he had these 4,000 objects, and they said, get get them out of here because they're taking over, because he really wanted to take them out of circulation, those hurtful objects, and it seems like a never-ending task, a task without end. But you've talked about seeing them in that place as a space under care. And so can you talk about that and how, is your music also performing that care for these things, I wonder?
I think that was a phrase that I heard Theaster talk about, that he said, in the main, these objects have been made for white amusement, and now they've been brought under black care. And what does that mean in this building? The objects are in a completely different context. And so you treat them in a different way. There's several catalogues for the Ed Williams collection, and there's a note that says, please handle this object with care. These books are holy. So I think there's a reverence in encountering the objects, because the kind of suffering that they, in some cases, physically show, like the many photographs of racial violence, the ritualized murders, the lynchings, they're witness to a certain kind of suffering. And then, of course, some of them are cartoons, some of them are drawn, some of them are written, some of them are, in newspaper articles to make people laugh, or postcards that you would buy at the shop to send to someone to amuse them. So I think in the library, in the Ed Williams collection, there's definitely been a question of how do we show these objects. And many times when I've been to the Arts Bank, they have been out, but they haven't been out. So sometimes a few objects are out, but the majority of the objects are in drawers or wrapped or in books. And so there's a certain amount of searching and investigation that you have to do to kind of find these things. And I think in the finding, there's some, curiosity, there's some trepidation, it's ritualized. And I think that's what I found, that, when you eventually did get to the back of the drawer and uncovered the tissue paper, for example, I found this one sculpture, I regarded it or perceived it as a sculpture at first. It's a metal sculpture of a boy, and he's maybe 2 or 3 years old. He's a toddler, and he's sitting on a potty. Do you guys call a potty the same thing we do? Yeah. So, and his mouth is open. He has this really big mouth, and his mouth is open. And it looks like he's having trouble on the toilet, he's like straining to use the toilet. So it's a sympathetic piece. And I was speaking about it earlier today, and I was saying there's a kind of care in the rendering of this sculpture. There's details, there's delicate eyebrows, there's teeth, there's lips, and the lips have texture, and there's hair coils. It's not like some of the derogatory objects, which are very roughly hewn, quickly done, cheaply made, and grotesque. There's a lot of work has gone into this piece, which is why I initially thought it was just a sculpture. And when I went to pick it up, even the details of the creases on the little toddler's arms, it's sympathetic. You go to pick it up, and the potty stayed behind, and I couldn't work out what this object was. And then I looked around in the bank and saw similar themes, potty and a toddler, and you pick it up. And I realized that these pieces were ashtrays. And in the case of this ashtray, the user would take the cigarette, either the lit cigarette, and they would put it out on the, on the face or the teeth of this boy sculpture, and then or they would put it lit into the mouth of the boy, or stub it out and then put it into the mouth of the boy. And I found it really startling that this piece was a public and social piece, thinking about an era when many, many people smoked, and this is a domestic object. It'd been the home, you would invite your guests to put their cigarette out into the mouth of this black child. And I thought, this is really alarming. It was made in the 30s or 40s. It was made in Chicago. It wasn't made in the 1860s in Alabama. So I thought that these objects, as you say, they bear witness to a certain kind of history, and also in the widespread distribution of them, they show how wide spread the thinking was in terms of the erasure of, black childhood, not seeing black children as innocent or to be protected anyway. So those kind of objects, they really affected me, and they came into this. I mean, there's one piece of music called Erasure, which is looking at the erasure of black childhood, the erasure of black personhood, the erasure of black femininity. But seeing that they had been brought into this kind of care, there was a certain kind of redemption for these figures and these things that they were treated in a way that said, we see the pain that you've witnessed, we honour that pain, we mourn and grieve with the pain. So yeah, it's really a profound collection to be around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another collection, I mean, that's just one collection. There's so many. There's the Ebony and Jet, the books, the magazines, but also Frankie Knuckles' records. And I wonder, for this beautiful album that you all have to get and listen to, please, because it's fabulous, just listen to it for like hours and hours and hours, and then you'll want to listen to it for hours and hours and hours more. But I'm wondering if that music, if you can talk about those archives as opposed to the ones you just described, the Negrobilia, and then how did that also make its way into this Black Rainbows album?
Yeah, the Frankie Knuckles archive was energized in the space, which was really good. So they would hold parties. Every week there was a party, and the DJ would be there, Dwayne Powell, and he was playing music from the Frankie Knuckles archive. So this would happen every week. So it happened in one of the weeks that we were there, a nighttime party. And the crowd was old and young and uptown and downtown and, fancy art collectors and students and people from the local community. It was a real mixture of people, but everyone had come to dance to this Frankie Knuckles music. If you think that he's curated this collection, he's played every one of these records, you can see where they're dog-eared when you look at it, which records have really been played, loads, which he's got 2 copies of, what he's got 3 copies of. Janet Jackson, with the hand bra, I saw that popping up a few times, or like ESG, or like records that you just love and recognize. And I thought that's a really good way to use the sound. They're not just lined up, but the music's been digitized. So when you're in the Arts Bank, you can hear like there's some art students kind of diligently recording every single side, and onto digital. So they have parties with them, and it's, I guess, like being at a Frankie Knuckles party, and as close as you can get, because it's only the music that he collected. And I think every night must have had a theme. And when we went, the theme was woes. So as you came up the stairs onto the first floor where the party was, in this kind of side room, which had windows to the outside, you had to walk past this pot, this vessel that Theaster Gates had made, and everyone who walked past it took a piece of paper, and everyone had to write down their woes. You had to write down the things that were weighing you down, the things that were holding you back, your recurring blues. So you wrote them on this piece of paper, and then you put it in the pot. Nobody could see it, so everyone furtively sort of did this. And then we came into the party, and we just danced and danced and danced, because that's the best way to engage with that music, So it's 3 or 4 hours of dancing. And it was a November night in Chicago. It was freezing cold. It had snowed on the first day of our 2-week trip, and that same snow was still there 2 weeks later. It hadn't melted. That's how cold it was. It hadn't snowed again, but the snow was going nowhere. It was just frozen. And so outside it was freezing, but inside the bank, the music was pumping, and the windows were getting hot and steamy, and the condensation was running down the windows. And people were in each other's faces. I mean, I remember this one guy just being like, he had a thing to work out, and he was like that far from my face, and I was returning the intensity, So I like things like that on a dance floor. You just get lost in it. And after the end of that, they brought out this vessel, and they set fire to all the things in the vessel, all the woes. And I remember, for me, on that night, the thing or things that I had written on this piece of paper, the recurring burdens, that they never weighed on me in the same manner ever again after this night. So I'm a real believer in dancing out your woes and the physicality of that, and sort of getting outside of your head and just sort of exercising it, exorcising and exercising. Yeah, that was really important. So that was a way that we engaged with the records. And then I wrote this piece of music, Put It Down, which was in response to this electronic project that Stephen Brown and Mikey Wilson, who I was working on with the record, they were doing, and they were just making these wild electronic experiments in our studio, which is attached to our house. And I was not involved in this project at first, and I was very heavily pregnant. And so when Steve would say, "Come upstairs, hear what we're doing," I would say, "Oh, I don't really feel like it at all. I'm just going to be downstairs. I'm just going to have a bath and just chill out and just be pregnant and tired." But then I would hear through the floor, above, like something happening, and I would hear all these wild sounds, and I'd hear these grooves. So, when Mikey went home and when Steve went to bed, I would go upstairs to the studio, put the headphones on, and just kind of get in to this thing. And it was easy, and I felt like I was back there in the bank, and I was dancing it out. And that narrative came of, putting it down, putting your burden down, feeling free, just uncoupling from the pain and regrets, the burdens. And so, yeah, there's a whole chunk of music that came out through Frankie Knuckles.
Mm-hmm. So Black Rainbows came out September 2023, and New York Times, our own John Perella, said, "It is a songwriter's leap into artistic freedom." And then you've also talked about Black Rainbows as being oneself inside of Blackness, offering, diverse ways to think about Blackness. And if you could talk about, I really find your generosity as a person, but also the generosity of thinking about freedom through the music. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, your artistic freedom in this album.
I felt incredibly free in making it. I think when I first started, I guess I would tell the contrast, which is I felt with my third record, I felt like I was under this massive pressure. I had this really successful album in my first record, and then my second album was, it was a critically acclaimed record, but it wasn't a massive selling record. But I wrote it before and after my first husband died when I was 29. And so it had this, pain in the record. And because of that, there was a lot of grace for me in the record label, because people were really respectful of my situation. And, they were really kind and sort of kept the distance. But I felt then by my third record, it was like, right, come on now, like you've made this massive record, and then we've given you the space you needed, but now it's time to really kind of get back to where you were. And there was a lot of focus on that, and so much had changed in music. People had gone from buying physical copies to streaming, and that put loads more pressures on artists, because you don't really make any money through streaming, the selling of records, in case you didn't know. And so there's a big focus on radio. So it was all like, you got to get a radio smash, you got to get a massive song. And so, they kind of said to me, like, do whatever you want on the 7 non-radio tracks, but we need 3 bangers on there. However it was put to me, it was kind of like, go ahead and make some hits, which of course I wanted to do for lots of different reasons. And it just proved really elusive to make that happen, because I think for everyone else there was a real backwards focus to sort of try and get back to a success I'd had. But for me, that really was like crossing a huge mental bridge, because I had been through such a huge loss or life change. And so I couldn't get back to, someone said to me at the label, "You're the sunshine girl." So I don't really actually feel like the sunshine girl. I feel like a more complex being. And so that complex being, like meshing with people's expectations, that was really hard. And and I've definitely received a lot of feedback about the music that I was making that is like not quite the right thing. And then by the time I'd carried on with it, I didn't need anyone else's feedback because I would just have that critic kind of in my head, and there would be so many things I would start but not even finish because I'd think, well, what's the point of finishing this? This doesn't sound like Bruno Mars's Uptown Funk. So what is the point of finishing? This isn't the international mega smash. So don't, so I just kind of had all these false starts. So when I went into making this record, I thought, I will never go back to that sort of place of, wondering, like, is this it? Is this it? Is this it? And getting so kind of burnt out or feeling like I was kind of doing pop music wrong. I felt like I was moving into a different kind of space. And actually, I had thought about this record as a side project. So I thought, I'm not going to put my name on it. I'm not going to make it with a major label. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to make this weird record in response to a typewriter, which I have. This is Mrs. Johnson's typewriter that she had the secretaries work on. So these typewriters came in black, gunmetal grey, or buff. And she said, "Can you make one in red alligator?" Which is what she did. And this is what the secretaries at the Johnson building typed on, as she came up. And I just thought that was it's so exuberant and so elegant and flashy and unconventional, and so objects like that would just make me think, why does the typewriter have to be grey or white or black? Why can't it be made out of red alligator? Like, what are the things that are holding you back? And so when I went into this project, I was like, yep, it's a side project, it's not my name, it's not on a label, and I'm writing a 10-minute song about the rock churches of Lalibela, and I'm writing a punk song about a beauty queen from the 50s, and as I sort of stepped into all of this, it was so freeing, including the fact that, of course, I was getting to spend so much time with Theaster Gates, and I would see his moves, and I would see how he operated in a space of no fear, and that made me really open my eyes. I thought, oh, that's what you have to do to make. You have to be unafraid, and especially unafraid of the people's reaction. I think there's so much music and music business and capitalism are so closely tied, so being good and being successful as an artist is synonymous with making lots of money as an artist. And of course, you make lots of money by being really popular. And so I think if that starts to become your truth as an artist, then your art is only good when it's really popular, which I think is definitely incongruous. And especially in the world of visual art, so many fantastic and great artists either had success late in life or died penniless, like a Van Gogh or, people, Modigliani, or selling paintings for absinthe, or a meal. So, there's no link between making good art and getting loads of money, but we have coupled them together, especially in music, to be that, the smart artist is like making paper, and that's the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And so I guess understanding that was really freeing to me. Yeah.
And you've also talked about, and you've just been talking about it, your previous albums being your own stories versus walking into these archives of so many stories. One of them is Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl from 1861, an enslaved narrative, Black women's enslaved narrative that, in academia and especially in Black studies, this is one of our touchstones, right? The loophole of retreat, the woman who hides in the garret for 7 years and in order to escape in a small crawl space. What I was so interested in that. I mean, that's when we met. That was one of the things I was like, wow, this is really speaking to what we do in Black Studies. But also, I just, love your lyrics. The lyrics in that one, and Jafari, we've both been captivated by the lyrics, I can see. But I think these lyrics, just some of them for me, and I'll just read a couple of them, for that song, Peach Velvet Sky, really capture the kind of fungibility of slavery, the idea that people are objects, going back to that. So for a silver saucer, right? So you're thinking about people being the same as an object, which she says 4 times. You won't have to hear me say it 4 times. Listen to the song. And then for a golden penny, my heart was betrayed. So these, I mean, it just distills these things down in another way for those of us who have taught this or who've thought about this, and all the artists. In fact, Renee Green was here as an artist in residence. She's done a piece on that. So I just want to, when you're going into these other stories and writing so beautifully about that, how did it, you're such a beautiful lyricist, how did that work for you, thinking about these stories? Did the words just pop out of the objects like that?
I think in many cases the words really did pop out of the objects, and many of you already know incidents in the life of a slave girl. So it's such a poetic book anyway. Think of the images there. Think of her sewing clothes for her children by the tiny crack of amount of light that's coming through. She's still managing to mother her children and provide for their needs, even though she's trapped, she's self-trapped in this building. So I just think of her labor and the way she unfolds her story. The beginning of the story is so beguiling to me, where she's talking about being a girl, a young girl, and living under the authority of her parents. And then as she gets a little bit older and her mother dies, and that shield is taken away, that she sees herself to be in this impossible superstructure that controls every aspect of her life in being on this plantation in North Carolina. So I think it's all there. It's really all there in that book. But the imagery for me was, I obviously remember the facts, but I remember certain physical things about, there's a time in a really hot summer in the crawl space where she's been attacked by these red spiders or these red ants, and they're biting her all over her body, and just sort of thinking of this sight of suffering. Or there's another time when she's hiding in the swamp and all the snakes are writhing and circling, and you think, oh, this. So she writes really physically. She writes in her body. She talks about how her body feels and how where it's comfortable to lay, where it's uncomfortable for her to lay, how the boards feel underneath her. So she talks about her daughter. She has 2 children with a local white man who becomes a politician, and her daughter goes away to work, and her daughter seems to be experiencing some of the same kind of psychosexual violence that she has escaped from. And she talks about the master or the slave owner pouring this poison into her ear, the things that he would sort of say to her. So it's really, her language is really, it's really poetic and really evocative, and it happens to your body when you read it. So I think, aside from the fact that there are very few of these first-person accounts of what it was like to survive these things, I think hers is really beloved because she's such an amazing teller of a tale. So I think with the words for that song, it was all the imagery of the darkness, thinking about the tiny weight of her children's hands, or thinking about the vastness of the sunset when she finally sees it when she's going north. And then thinking of the containment, the contrast between being able to see through just, see that much daylight pretty much for, 7 years, and then the sort of technical, wide landscape thing of the breath of freedom, you know, the contrast between those things. So I think the book itself has so much brilliant language in it, and I felt like if you just kind of, I know, rolling around in that book for long enough, like it will sort of come through. But yeah, it does feel really different to tell other people's stories, and yet in that song, the I of the singer is the Harriet Jacobs voice. So I didn't realise that I had done it like that. But when I'm singing I in that song, I'm sort of being her in that song. And to me, that was really powerful because, you know, I think about ancestry a lot. So, you know, my dad's family is from the St. Kitts, and they have this, you know, the enslaved history. So, and there's so little I know, you know, because you can only get back so far. So I think about these people a lot, and definitely when I had children, you know, I would be breastfeeding my children, I'd be sort of felt this lineage, this kind of line of my ancestors. I just felt it. Like, I'm sure some of you had these weird experiences, right? I'm not the only person I know that. Yeah, you feel this, you feel the connection to people who've gone before you, especially in these doorways of sort of birth. And so it just kind of sat with me that I sort of felt like, who are these people going back and back and back? And I thought about their freedom. I felt like the actions that we make now, we somehow can communicate to them in their time, and it makes their time feel different to them because they know what happened to their line. Like, we're all them, we're all the same, you know, think of the interconnectedness of all things. And especially, you know, people who have your DNA and you have theirs. So, yeah, that freedom and the telling, their story is your story. That's I think that I'm saying. The story of my ancestors I don't get to know. Perhaps they weren't literate. Perhaps they didn't make these escapes. But they're in, you know, they're in our bones.
Mm-hmm. This will be my last question, because I know other people have questions, but part of this book came to you from your aunts, right?
Yes.
Who, thinking about diaspora, this is another reason, you know, African American and African diaspora studies is our department at Columbia. One of my areas is Black Britain, which I've been doing for many, many years, and went first to Britain because my sister, Lisa Jones, was there, and I said, if my sister's there writing, becoming a writer, I'm gonna go find out what's going on over there, and met so many wonderful artists, Isaac Julian, met Kobina Mercer, Ingrid Pollard, such an exciting time over there, but it opened my eyes to the idea of diaspora, what it was, by going there. And your story about getting the Harriet Jacobs book, right, is from your aunts who had come, St. Kitts, England, and then went to New Jersey,
yeah,
and were there sending you things like books, you said barrettes, all sorts of stuff. And
Kool-Aid.
Kool-Aid. So I'm just wondering about the context. I mean, a lot of both the objects, but also, you know, it seems like your fascination with objects comes maybe from that in some ways. But also just the Leeds experience for you because, you know, again, being linked to diaspora, but some of these artists that, you know, started making a name for themselves in the 80s were based in the Midlands, right, in Birmingham, but Leeds is much further north. So was there any kind of Black artistic activity there for you at the time when you were growing up, or, you know, is it, you know, Midlands, London? Is there anything that we should know about Leeds and that?
The main Black artistic practices that were happening in Leeds when I was growing up and still continuing were in dance. Leeds has some Black-founded dance companies. Phoenix Dance is 50 years old now. So these dance companies started off, there was a teacher, this young white teacher called Nadine Senior, that was a very serious, you know, kind of Martha Graham trained contemporary dancer who was a teacher at the local middle school. And she was a teacher in Chapeltown, which is the majority Black Caribbean area in Leeds, you know, where my grandparents moved from St. Kitts and had their children, and almost all the Caribbeans came to this area in Chapeltown. And some of these children had, as you can imagine, a difficult time at school because Britain had its colonies in the Caribbean, and it was assumed of many Caribbean children that they were educationally subnormal or that they weren't well educated, so that in some cases children weren't given textbooks in science lessons, or children were treated unfairly by classmates and also by teachers. You know, there were so Leeds was really a politicized place. There was a big protest against a particular middle school and a head teacher, where it's felt the head teacher was excluding children from school and generally running the school in a way that was exclusive to these black children. And so the black parents decided to boycott the school, and they kept their children home. They just kept the children not attending school until something was done about this head teacher, and eventually the head teacher was fired from this school. But in the same school, there was Nadine Senior, who was this brilliant Martha Graham dance woman. And some of these kids who'd been told or discouraged or found the subjects hard because there were so many other things for them to contend with in the class, especially these young black boys, she would treat them like they were professional contemporary dancers. And you see photographs from the time, and there's these kind of 9-year-old boys just, you know, in the gym. They're meant to be doing PE, but they're doing contemporary dance. And so many of those children came up under her, trained in high school, and then when they left high school, they wanted to be professional dancers, and they found that there wasn't the work for them, not in London, certainly not in Leeds. So one of them just decided he was going to found his own dance company, and he did, and it was called Phoenix Dance, and it started off with 5 Caribbean men from the UK, from Leeds, and they made their own dance school, and it was called, and also Nadine Senior had opened up Northern School of Contemporary Dance, so that's where they did their further education, higher education, then they went to do further education. And they made their own school, and they put on their own performances. They're documented, you know, they took the photographs. It was super progressive, you know, sometimes they'll be in silks and costumes, sometimes it'd be in kind of 1950s suits, and it was really vibrant, the dancing, and this school continued. I mean, it's continued to this present day, it's still going. So that sort of dance school stuff was around when I was a kid. And my sister studied at Northern School of Contemporary Dance, and we were in that space doing events. So I think in Chapeltown, when I was about 12, there was this big fashion show of local kids, you know, so fashion designers showing their clothes. We put on the clothes, we were the models, you know, we went up and down the aisle. I played my violin with and a boy called Cornell, who had a crush on, who played the piano. And so it was kind of like a black talent show for black teens. So there was a really big black community in Leeds. The other event was the carnival. The Leeds West Indian Carnival is the longest standing black carnival, Caribbean carnival in Europe. We're always very proud of this. So it's older than the Notting Hill Carnival. Wow. And it was started by a Caribbean man called Arthur France, who went to the Leeds Council and said, you know, there's a lot of us here. We want to have a carnival. We need you to close down the streets. We need you to make the police stop the cars driving down here. And we're going to go all the way into Hare Hills and all the way back round. You know, I think it's 4 or 5 miles. And they said yes. And they did it. And you see early footage of these carnivals, and it's beautiful because it's the local Caribbeans. And then it's just, you know, local people from the community, you know, mostly white people, just in it, you know, just sort of enjoying it. And you see, sometimes it's kind of elderly white people, like grannies, and they just appreciating these little kids dressed up in these costumes, and I felt like it was a sort of undeniable glamour and grandeur and vivaciousness that was shown in the carnival between the steel drums and the dance styles and the costumes and the celebratory nature and the food. People would make big things of plantain and rice and peas and sugarcane and sell it on the streets, and then there's this big jam that happens in the park afterwards. I felt like it was a real public, it's a celebration, it was a black community celebration, but it had a wider impact on the wider community. And I always remember the pride of, being at the carnival. I was in it a few times in troops, but we would always go. It went past the bottom of my nana's street, so we would always, I went last year, it's like I always go to it. And that's a big event. So yeah, I think Leeds had a really big Caribbean population. I wasn't aware of the Caribbean literature when I was growing up, definitely not. So I kind of knew Caribbean music, soca, reggae, dancehall, and I knew the carnival, and I knew this dance company. But my literature was, Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Dubose and all, it was here. Because I guess that is what I could find, I think African-American literature was very well established and widely distributed. It was only really went to university that I started reading Caribbean authors and poets.
Fantastic. This is a story even Dr. Allen didn't know. Some of us out here may have known it.
I'll send that book for 50 Years of Phoenix Dance. It's really good, really good.
Well, now I think we can open it up for questions, a few questions, before our wonderful guest will then share a little bit of her art with us. So, okay, we have mics coming around. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Nicole, and I'm a big fan of yours. And I saw you at Black Girls Rock maybe 2018?
I remember that, yeah.
With Imani Azuri,
Yes.
and I can't remember the name of the other sister. And I noticed something felt like it had changed in how you were singing. And then I saw a viral video, I think it was viral, of you singing maybe a blues or a gospel, a spiritual song with Theaster and maybe 3 other people
Right.
recently. And I'm like, something has changed. So I didn't know that you had experienced such loss, and my sympathies are with you. My question is, I believe there is something inherently beautiful about Black grief. It's so horrific. It's probably the most horrific form of grief in this world. And out of it, Africans, Black folks from the diaspora have found gifts and beauty. And so I wanted to know somehow, like even your album cover looks like one you're in a cocoon, or 2 indigenous folks are buried with their knees to their chest like that. So did you find something in a death of yours, in your own death, or in the grief that you have applied to your music, where it has now made you, I don't want to say a better singer, but such a more spectacular singer?
Thank you. I definitely think that grief just, well, I think it was 2 things. One is it just changes your capacity, all your capacities, like the physical spaces, I think. So your capacity to feel pain, So I remember a certain volume of pain, thinking that this is impossible. I can't sort of hold this pain, But then you realize that you can, because you are holding it. And I think that's the same in many different aspects. I have never really experienced a lot of physical pain, but I have, I've given birth twice naturally to 2 children. So it's like that's a very physical thing too. Whereas just at home in some water, and it's like that's the same as well, where you get to a point where you think, oh, this is getting so intense. How will I be able to bear this? And then it just kind of like goes away, and I felt like it was really similar to grief in that it becomes so impossible, and you think you can't do any, and then it just like recedes, and so I feel like riding those kind of waves is that's definitely changed me as a person, But the other thing I found with grief is a sense of interconnectedness with everyone. You know, I remember watching these, these several films I thought to myself were just kind of very light, sweet films. And I thought, let me just put these on because I'd have to think about grief. And in every single one of them was a bereavement that, because I hadn't lost anyone before, I had maybe just thought of as kind of like a cute moment in a film, a sort of sweet thing to gloss over. And then suddenly, as I was watching this film, I thought, how have I not seen all of this death in these films? And it's because I wasn't looking at it. And then I think, once you have experienced a loss, then you just sort of roar, and it's like a skin's fallen off that never comes back on again. And so I felt a real interconnectedness with everybody. And, when I was touring the sea, so many of the songs were about loss. And then at the end of the show, I would talk to people, and people say, I lost my father, or I lost my husband, I lost my child, I lost my wife. And I would feel so sort of overwhelmed by these stories, and just how aware of how sort of ignorant I had been before that moment to other people's pain, And then I just really remember being sort of keenly tuned into it. Or I would go somewhere and see a woman, calmly driving a sports car off a cruise, a ship, going to a new place. And in my head, I would sort of picture her as a widow, because I saw her kind of independence and pride and strength. And so I think that grief definitely linked me to other people, and I think that makes you a better communicator of music. And I think it also changed the internal makeup of me, and I think that definitely makes you, forever different. Yeah, definitely.
Hello.
Hi.
Thinking of still on like grief, I'm also thinking about surrender, and I'm thinking about like the fact that you are on these tours, and even today, like as you continue to be an artist, what is like? Could you speak to some of your rituals in terms of like surrendering in a moment to tell the story, to tell your story, to tell the stories from the bank in Chicago? What do you do for yourself so that you can continue to tell these stories? I'm just thinking a lot about that. How do you care for yourself? Yeah, so that you can continue to care for these stories.
That's a really good question, and I haven't thought of it like that. The need to care for oneself in order to continue to do work. Yeah, I haven't really thought of it like that. I think one thing is that when I sing these songs, or when I perform at all, I always feel like I get so much back in. So sometimes when I get on stage, we've just done these four days at the Blue Note, 4 nights, but it was 8 shows. So it was a show at 8 and a show at 10:30, and when I was approaching it, I thought, I hope my voice lasts, because I haven't really done that, not for a while. And it's, I'm talking a lot in the shows as well. But I would feel, sometimes I would go on stage and think, like I'm really, like I'm going into it tired. But I always come off really kind of euphoric, because I feel like I get so much from it. So I think the more I put into it, the more I get out of it. That's what I think. But with a background caveat of, I take note in what you're saying that it is important to, sleep. So yeah, I need to sort of work on that side of self-care. Like I definitely do. And, I have young children as well, so it's like all the fronts, so, but yeah, I will say, remember I met someone in the audience who told me I have to look after myself. I'll tell some people, I say, I need some more rest. Yeah.
And on that note, I think we will let you, we would be so honored for you to be here and share a couple of songs with us.
I'd love to.
Yeah. So why don't we thank Corinne Bailey Rae for her conversation.
Thanks, and thank you, Ken. Thank you, Dr. James.